Would you mind just to start out, just sort of saying your name, your title, and a little bit about your background?
I'm Frank Pennisi. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of EFI, a digital inkjet printing company. I grew up in operations and manufacturing, and after multiple functions, industries, and started leading businesses.
Wonderful. I'm curious, Frank, as you think about operational excellence, when you hear that, what does that mean to you?
I always tell my team the difference between strategy and operational excellence. Strategy is doing something that your competitors are not doing. It's doing something different from your competitors. Operational excellence is doing the same things that your competitors do, but doing it much better.
I love that distinction. I'm curious, as you're talking to your team and you're thinking about what's the difference between strategy and operational excellence, what are some of the biggest challenges you feel an organization faces in getting to that point where you can be doing the same thing as your competitors, but you're just operating at such a high level?
I'm hearkening back to a quote I learned when I was working at GE when they started finding ways to harness the power of the workforce. And a worker said, "You hired me for my arms and legs when you could have gotten my brain for free." And that has resonated with me for a long time. And getting a culture that is empowered and problem solving and feels as though that they are in a safe enough environment where they can speak freely and transparently is one of the biggest things that allows you to become operational excellence over time. I'll tell you, EFI has historically been a top-down company, and we're striving to change that culture to become one of more problem solving and coaching.
How do you, as a leader, how do you start tackling that problem? How do you think about encouraging that problem solving? Like you said, sort of allowing folks to really use their brains and not just their arms and legs.
Yeah, a couple of KPIs, things like layers and span, where you don't give managers the ability to micromanage because they have enough employees that they have kind of no choice but to empower their workforce. The other things are participations of Kaizens and cross-functional workshops and training from the top down, a culture of coaching as opposed to telling people what to do and having people go and do it.
I'm curious, it sort of sounds like there's almost like a natural bridge here between the way in which you're looking at operational excellence and encouraging this problem solving and also maybe using these folks to actually identify potential risks or disruptions to the business. And I'm curious like, what kind of role you think that risk management or risk identification kind of plays in keeping your business running and running at a high level.
Yeah, historically, our business has had a tendency to over forecast and under deliver. And a lot of that was optimism, but a lot of it was simply not having discipline and process in place to recognize some of the risks that inevitably come up and accounting for and mitigating those risks. So if you're not thinking about what can go wrong and figuring out how to prevent them in a proactive way, a lot of times those things do in fact go wrong, and it's manifested itself in some historical results that we've had as a business.
Do you think that it feels like in recent years, and maybe everyone always says this at every point in history, but it feels like in recent years there have been quite a lot of risks and disruptions with the pandemic and all the geopolitical activity. And so I'm wondering how your approach to that has maybe had to change or adapt.
Yeah, I think you read some of the articles and they talk about moving from just in time to just in case. Some of the things to think about there are, do you do dual sourcing? Do you do near sourcing? Are you more considerate about how you vertically integrate versus not? There's just a lot of things that you have to take into account with controllable left. So it's just being more partnering or more redundant in that value chain.
I wonder, as you look at your frontline leaders too, I'm curious kind of how you're thinking about their role in mitigating risk and understanding emerging risks, and how do you help prepare those frontline leaders for risks that might be emerging on the horizon, or sort of dealing with really understanding how to forecast and understand possible risk and disruption.
Yeah, this comes down to creating a culture of transparency, allowing for and teaching folks how to coach and problem solve as opposed to direct. if you're in a top-down culture and you say do this, and you don't create an environment where people have the ability to say, what about this? That will get done. And you hope that that other risk that the person is thinking about doesn't materialize. So as we move deeper in the organization, we're going to strive to create a constant back and forth culture of transparency, coaching, and problem solving to get us to start identifying those risks and have the psychological safety to be able to do so.
Love that sort of idea of building that trust and transparency across the workforce. I'm curious if you could give any one piece of advice to other operational leaders about either sort of how to cultivate that culture of transparency and that psychological safety with leaders, as you said, sort of all the way down through the organization. Where would you tell that leader to start?
So I've got to start by saying there is a lot of it having to be top down. If you don't exhibit these behaviors yourself, your company will not exhibit those behaviors as well. There are just some classic examples of you have two ears and one mouth. You should listen twice as much as you speak. You should be truly deliberate about asking about risk and being open to and willing to learn what things can go wrong and what ideas can be put into place to address them. And as for things like problem solving and cross-functional involvement, all organizations have tension built into them. You have to think about where the tension is constructive and where it's destructive, and ensure that you either processes or rhythms or organizational structure in place to make the tension that exists in an organization constructive, to allow for that good discussion that does, in fact, start to empower and problem solve. But it does have to come from the top down.
I really like that idea about sort of you have to be deliberate in asking about risk, because I feel like it might be so easy to disregard or not want to see potentially what all of those risks are. How do you ask about risk? Like, how do you encourage your leaders to do that listening and gather that information from employees who, as you said, these are folks that have brains that are on the front line that are seeing things that might be able to highlight risks that are otherwise unseen?
So there are a couple of tools in a continuous improvement tool belt that allow it or enable it. One's the FMEA, Failure Modes and Effects Analysis tool. That happens to be one of the stronger ones. Kaizens also encourage this sort of behavior. And essentially, the other are even things like stage gates or scrum processes, depending on whether or not you're developing hardware or software type things, where you've got checklists of, have you asked these people what can go wrong? Have you accounted for this? Have you gotten everybody in a room and talked about all the things that could go wrong and quantified it by probability and the damage it can cause? And if you have a culture where you are willing to get everybody in a room and listen to what they have to say, it starts to perpetuate that ability of filtering and being more aware and transparent of risks that can occur.
I just did want to ask though, is there anything that I didn't ask you about either what operational excellence should look like, or how organizations can strive to achieve that, or how operational leaders should approach this idea of risk management? Anything I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything about either of those topics that you feel like is really important that we didn't get to in the conversation?
I think the other thing that's tricky is if you have historically had a top-down leadership structure, almost by design, you have a weak bench, and you have a lot of people that you are moving to frontline leaders and even higher leaders that don't necessarily have the skills, training, and experience to identify risks, to listen carefully, because they've always been individual contributors and they've done what they're told and they're expecting input from the ranks. So the single biggest thing is, what can you do to empower and train them through tools, coaching, and help to ensure that they can perpetuate this culture of problem solving and risk mitigation?
I've heard from a few leaders in similar conversations that so often you have sort of like your best operator then moves into a leadership role. And because that's just the way that organizational structure typically works. And there is this whole layer, to your point, of problem solving and understanding risk and potential for risk and how to resolve that, that maybe isn't necessarily part of the reason that operator was promoted into that role. And so I also wonder too, if you see opportunities to even identify some of those skill sets in your operators early on to sort of help move them into these leadership positions and roles.
Interestingly, some of the people who do their individual contributor work best are not necessarily the best leaders, as some of us have probably learned through experience. And sometimes some of the worst individual contributors are the best leaders because they're constantly questioning and figuring out how to do things better. And that may be to a frustration or an annoyance to a top-down culture. So there are specific traits and skills that you can and should seek out that could drive what you're trying to do within a culture to change it to be more empowering, more questioning of what can go wrong and what you should do about it. And I'll tell you, it takes at least 3 years to change a culture, and that's assuming you're going after it deliberately.
Yeah, it feels like it's just there are so many moving parts to, as you said, you're not just sort of changing the way things work, you're trying to change the way people think in some ways or encourage them to think more and be receptive and transparent to those things. Thank you so much. This is all really fantastic, really fantastic stuff.